Our next speaker is going to be Miriam Collins. She's a patient advocate and law student, a final year law student in the University of Galway, and she has FND since the age of 14. She's passionate about raising awareness of FND and advocating for greater access for support for people living with FND by sharing her own lived experience with the condition. And Miriam is also a volunteer with FND Ireland. Thanks so much.
Hi everyone. As Owen has done a wonderful job introducing me, my name is Miriam, and I've been living with FND since I was 14. I was diagnosed at 18, and I am now 22 years old, as mentioned, in my final year of university. And I'm really grateful that Eamon asked me and gave me this opportunity to speak with everyone about my experience living with FND. For anyone that might have noticed, I came in a bit of a frantic rush, so public transport was not my friend this morning. So when I first started back in, I think, August, when Eamon mentioned to me about the conference, when I started thinking about what I would talk about, I focused a lot on the clinical aspect of my story, my symptoms, which include seizures and motor symptoms. And it was really the story that I had repeated and that many people will likely be familiar with, of when you sit down with a doctor for the first time and try and explain the journey you've had trying to access supports. But I had somehow, in writing that, left out the most important part of my story, which is actually living with FND and the experiences I've had and the impact it's had on me. And I realized that that's because in most of my doctor's appointments, my doctors haven't had time for that part of my story. They haven't asked me about the day-to-day impact. And I didn't want that to be what I focused on today, because that's the most important part. It's looking and being open to looking at the challenges and barriers I faced, but also I hope to focus a little bit on some of the hope and joy I have found living with this condition, because it hasn't been all bad. And before I get into my own personal story, given I know many people here today will be patients or carers with lived experience with this condition, is to just highlight that there is immense power in the story of every person who has experience with this condition, and that these experiences really deserve to be heard, not just in our doctor's appointments, but also in, for example, universities, in workplaces, and in policy discussions. And I'm really glad that Eamon is focusing on that in today's conference by starting off with myself and Rachel. So with that in mind, I'm going to share my story with you all today, not just as a patient, but as a person who has lived with FND for 8 years. Before my diagnosis, I spent 4 years experiencing functional seizures without knowing what they were. These were unexplained episodes amongst a myriad of other symptoms that really shaped my teenage years in ways that I probably still don't fully understand. They affected my sense of independence, my confidence, and my sense of identity growing up. I was a really independent person as a teenager, a very stubborn 15-year-old, and these symptoms still managed to hold me back despite that. I avoided public transport, social outings. Even school trips made me quite nervous. For many people, you will know the quintessential transition year trip when you go to a foreign country with your class. And when I was in TY, instead of signing up to go on that trip, I organized a trip to Venice with my parents because I was scared of being far away from them or being in a foreign country with these unexplained symptoms and ending up in a hospital with a language barrier when no one knew what was going on. And also, another thing that I didn't realize until I started college was that I was so used to my parents driving me everywhere. I didn't take a bus until I was 19. And that was because they didn't want to be far away. So the impact it had on my parents was that at a time when I was supposed to be growing up and gaining independence, they were really reluctant to let me go. Without a diagnosis or the proper supports for myself or my family, we were all left trying to survive something that we couldn't even name. These episodes also caused a lot of tension with my school, and this kind of contributed to a wider issue of me trying to figure out who I was with this condition. Because if I had an episode in school, I was trying to minimize the impact that they were having on me so that they wouldn't send me home. But then I would go to my doctor's appointments and have to amplify these episodes and these challenges to try and justify and make my experiences valid, which was really difficult to jump between two identities, that of the patient and of a teenager that was creative, intelligent, had ambitions for what she wanted to do with her life. And this was a real tension that I probably still suffer with in trying to both prove to myself that I'm good enough despite this condition, which I shouldn't have to prove. So the timing of this was great, because 2 weeks before my leaving cert, I got diagnosed with FND. Amazing timing. And I remember that appointment with my neurologist and being told very simply, you have what is known as functional neurological disorder. And I had this immense sense of relief because I had a name, which was something I had been deprived of for 4 years. I had this label, and I had this confirmation that what I was experiencing was real, despite sometimes feeling in my own head that maybe I was making it up. But this relief was really sadly short-lived because my neurologist made FND sound like this really simple and manageable condition. And it left me really unprepared for what was in reality laying before me with this condition. When I started college, I went back to my neurologist with worsening seizures and new motor symptoms such as paralysis and weakness. And the most unhelpful interaction I've ever had with a healthcare professional was when she told me that I was an irregularity and that most people, once they're diagnosed, are symptom-free within a year. I can feel the eye rolls. I felt like I was the subject of a game of hot potato with all of the medical practitioners being the participants. My neurologist sent me to psychology, gave me no referral. I went to my GP, who sent me to mental health, who said I needed a more specialized psychologist, who I sat on a public waitlist for 14 months before pursuing private options, found a private neuropsychologist who I did work with for over a year, but she ultimately couldn't help me with my motor symptoms and sent me back to neurology, who sent me back to psychology. I pursued occupational therapy through the primary care, separate from my neurologist, got a GP referral to that. The occupational therapist sent me to physio. I did not need physio, I'd been in physio. The physiotherapist sat down with me. 45 minutes later, we said, yep, back to occupational therapy, sat on another wait list. Finally got in with an occupational therapist in the public healthcare system, and she informed me that she did not believe that she had the expertise of FND to adequately support me, and suggested I pursue private options. That was back in May, and as I'm sure many people can relate to the experience of medical burnout, I have taken a step back from the healthcare system to just try and get my bearings. And all the while I was jumping between these doctor's appointments with the potential in my day-to-day life of being stuck in my apartment or reliant, as tended to be the way of my friends, carrying me around until a flare passed without any practical supports to maintain my quality of life. And it really felt like no professional cared about the impact that my FND was having on me, because their focus was on whether they could make me better, not whether they could make my life better. And there really was a difference. So what I want to highlight with that story is that there's a real value and importance of focusing not just on the long-term recovery of patients with FND, because do not get me wrong, do not mistake me, that is such a valuable focus to have in medical appointments. But it is equally important to focus on how people with FND can both survive, and I will emphasize, thrive in their everyday lives. One moment with my neurologist that particularly struck me when I started college was her recommendation that I cut out all my extracurriculars to be able to manage my seizures, my fatigue, and my brain fog. And that wasn't the college experience I wanted. She basically proposed go to class and go home. And that, like, when you're 18, 19, that's not the life you want for yourself. And university really was my chance to build a community around myself, to learn to live with my disability. And it has, by God, never been easy, but it has also been the greatest experience of my life. And my stubbornness to live the life I want to live has admittedly been my downfall as often as it's been like the thing that gets me through to the next day. And that's the reality of living with FND. It's that you can be powerless against your symptoms even with all of your best attempts to manage them. Like the people around you can be such amazing supports, but you can still be frustrated with the feeling that your body's determined to turn against you. And trying to, in that journey, shift professionals' focus from not just symptom minimization, but also to what I like to call disaster planning, planning for when everything goes wrong and nothing works. But all of the professionals around me made me feel like that was a form of giving up. And I don't think that that's a fair representation of what I was looking for, which was just the practical reality that I wanted to live my life on my terms, regardless of what my symptoms were. So when we consider implementing short-term aids with FND and adaptations that allow someone to live their day-to-day life, it's not a failure, it's just practical. I guess that one's aimed at any of the healthcare practitioners in the audience. And I want to end today, because I know it can be easy to talk about all of the negatives, the difficulties of living with this condition. My dad, when I was 18 and diagnosed and really struggling with my mental health, introduced me to the concept of glimmers, which is basically the opposite of a trigger. It's when everything feels kind of hopeless. There's these things that you can look to bring a bit of hope to your everyday life. And I want to finish today by looking at some of the glimmers I have found living with this condition. Firstly, and I think many people will relate to this, is I have found an immense community from living with this condition, both, for example, most recently from FND Ireland, but also in my wider friendship group and social network. I have formed truly genuine and authentic friendships that my FND has strengthened rather than weakened in college, which I definitely never expected to be the case. I have friends who both make sure I get home safe after a seizure, but then stay to make sure that I'm emotionally okay. They turn seizure recovery into impromptu hangouts and gossip sessions, which is a young person's ideal. It's social and recovery. And they also helped me to realize that there were many ways that I could give back to a relationship that, even with my unpredictable symptoms, for example, I help them with their homework or I bake for them. I give what I can and they accept that. And that taught me that living with FND does not make me a burden on those around me. And those that stuck around and saw the person behind the medical condition became a real support network that I wouldn't be where I am today without them. Second, as cliched as it sounds, yes, I'm checking my time. As cliched as it sounds, I discovered the true power of my voice living with this condition. It really taught me that throughout life, both in relation to this condition and just in general, I was going to have to fight for what I needed in school, in healthcare, and just in society as a whole. And while no one should ever have to fight for themselves, it's a really powerful tool to realize you can. I've become an advocate in my university for access and awareness raising. I have sat on forums regarding disability access in third-level universities. I've engaged with staff about seizure awareness, which just on a very small level has increased awareness about functional seizures across my university's security staff, my lecturers in the School of Law. Small conversations led to a lot of empathy and understanding coming to the fore. And while it's not easy to be your own best advocate, it's also probably the reason I was drawn to law. And I'm not sure I would have found the career path that lies before me if not for growing up with this condition. And so while the symptoms are difficult and challenging, and if someone handed me a magic pill tomorrow and said this would make it all go away, I would take it without a second thought. I'm also incredibly grateful for what the empathy and compassion that this condition has taught me. And I think in a way it's made every seizure worth it, which might be a very strong statement to say. And lastly, as any good list demands, must be in threes, I learned that having FND did not stop me from being truly myself, and that implementing adaptations was not a form of weakness, which that was a really strong mentality I had for a lot of my teenage years, because I didn't act like everyone else my age. I had this thing that made me different. So every day I wake up, I'm a person that lives with FND. But I'm also so much more than that. I am a student, I'm a really good student. I am a friend, I am a baker, I'm a seamstress. There are so many other descriptions I can attach to myself than just being a patient with FND. And accepting that I am a patient with FND as a part of a multifaceted person has allowed me to truly become more fully myself. For example, and implementing adaptations contributed to that. And they didn't just have to be mobility aids. When I have a really bad hand tremor, and when my hands started shaking more, my dad got me really small thing, a needle threader to be able to thread my sewing needles because I just couldn't do it anymore. Or when I was baking in college, I bought an electric mixer because that took less of the energy, so I was still able to do something I loved with just a slight alteration. I've learned that pacing has been really important for my everyday life to get through all of my commitments. And I take breaks when I need, working on it. I'm sure we all know the urge to do more than we probably should. I go to the gym twice a week when I'm able to, but I also use crutches if I need to, and I have a wheelchair for when everything's really bad. So when my neurologist told me to lessen my load to get through this condition, while I've definitely gotten better at distributing it, I have pretty much refused to sacrifice the things that I care most about. And I'm not saying that sheer stubbornness and brute force will get through this condition, because it has been my downfall, like I mentioned, as much as it's been my salvation. But having the right supports in place to take the breaks I need, people in my corner who love me unconditionally, and learning to live with FND and live alongside it rather than in spite of it, has shown me that this condition, as complicated as it is, doesn't make life any less worth living to the fullest. And I guess when I say that and when I conclude on that, I want to just bring that focus back to today. We're starting a conversation about supporting people living with FND, and just realizing that those supports, they deserve to focus not just on being symptom-free, but also on living life as best we can as each day comes, even when it's hard, especially when it's good. This condition is dynamic, and we need to be dynamic with it. And I guess I'm still learning to do that, as I'm sure everyone is. But I hope that in sharing my story, we can both be able to see the hard things and work on them, but also acknowledge that there's a lot of good as well.